Hey, stop scrolling for a second. What I'm about to tell you happened in a mansion worth $12 million. On the night a woman put on the most beautiful blue dress of her life and smiled for everyone at the party. But behind one closed door, another woman was crying so hard she couldn't breathe. Nobody heard her. Nobody except one man. And when he opened that door, his entire life, everything he thought he understood about love, loyalty, and the woman he was about to marry, came crashing down in a single moment. I'm not going to tell you what he found. Not yet. Because trust me, you need to hear this whole thing from the beginning. Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Tonight's story is one of the most emotional ones I've ever shared. A story about wealth, betrayal, silence, and one small act of kindness that ended up changing 3 lives forever. It's the kind of story that makes you question who really deserves to be loved. Stay with me till the end. Because the twist in this one, I promise you will not see coming. It started like every other day at the Whitfield estate. Daniel Whitfield was 38 years old, and by every outward measure, he had everything. A tech company he'd built from a garage in Austin into a billion-dollar empire. A mansion in the hills outside San Francisco with views that made grown men go quiet. A closet full of watches he never wore twice. And in 6 weeks, a wedding that would be featured in 3 magazines. His fiancée, Isabel Grant, was the kind of beautiful that stopped conversations. She had golden hair, a laugh that sounded like wind chimes, and an instinct for saying exactly the right thing to exactly the right person. Daniel had met her at a charity gala 18 months earlier. She'd walked up to him holding 2 glasses of champagne, handed him one and said, "You looked like you needed rescuing from that conversation." He'd laughed. He'd fallen. It had felt at the time like the easiest thing in the world. Tonight, the house was full of light and music. Caterers moved through the halls with trays of food that cost more per plate than most people's monthly rent. Isabel stood at the top of the grand staircase in a blue satin gown, laughing with a circle of her friends, champagne glass in hand, the chandelier above her throwing gold light across her shoulders. She looked, Daniel thought as he watched her from across the room, like something out of a painting. He didn't know yet that somewhere below him, behind a closed door, a woman was suffocating on her own fear. Her name was Rosa Delgado. She was 29 years old, and she had worked as a housekeeper for the Whitfield estate for the past 3 years. She'd come to the United States from Guatemala when she was 19, following a promise of a better life for herself and eventually for her daughter Lucia, who was 6 years old and waiting for her mother at a small apartment 40 minutes away, in the care of a neighbor Rosa trusted with her whole heart because she had no other choice. Rosa was quiet. She kept her head down. She folded towels with more care than most people folded their own clothes. She had never once in 3 years been late. She had never once complained, not when she worked 16-hour days during party season, not when guests spoke to her like she was invisible, not even the time a guest's dog bit her hand and nobody asked if she was okay. Tonight, Rosa had been assigned to manage the upstairs linen closet and the guest bathrooms, restocking towels, refreshing soaps, making sure everything upstairs looked as flawless as everything downstairs. It was simple work. She had done it 100 times. But tonight was different. Tonight, while straightening the shelves in the closet just off the master hallway, Rosa had accidentally knocked over a small decorative box on the top shelf, one that didn't belong to the linens at all. It must have been placed there and forgotten, tucked behind a stack of folded towels. When it fell, papers spilled out across the closet floor. Rosa hadn't meant to look. She really hadn't. But as she gathered the papers to put them back, one document caught her eye. A name she recognized, dates that didn't make sense, numbers that didn't add up. Her hands had started shaking before her mind even understood why. That was when she heard footsteps coming fast down the hallway. And a voice, sharp, cold, nothing like the wind chime laugh from downstairs. "What are you doing in here?" Rosa turned, papers still in her hands, and found herself staring into the eyes of Isabel Grant. The chandelier light didn't reach into this hallway. And the woman standing in the doorway didn't look like the woman laughing on the staircase 5 minutes ago. "I was just organizing the—" Rosa began. "Give me those." Isabel's voice had dropped to something Rosa had never heard from her before. Not cold, not angry. Frightened. And frightened people, Rosa would learn that night, are the most dangerous people of all. Rosa handed the papers back immediately, her heart hammering. "I didn't read anything, I promise, I was just—" "Get in there." Isabel nodded toward the closet. "What?" "Get in there." Isabel's hand closed around Rosa's arm, and before Rosa could process what was happening, she was being pushed backward into the closet, past the shelves of folded towels and hanging garment bags, into the dark. "Please," Rosa said, her voice cracking. "Please, I have a daughter, I need my job, I won't say anything, I promise you I—" The door shut. Rosa heard the lock click from the outside. And then she heard Isabel's footsteps walking away, unhurried, calm, like nothing at all had happened, like she was simply returning to her party, to her champagne, to her guests, to the laugh that sounded like wind chimes. Rosa sat down on the closet floor in the dark, surrounded by soft towels and expensive fabric, and she began to cry. Quietly at first, and then not quietly at all, because no matter how hard she pressed her hand against her mouth, the fear had nowhere else to go. Downstairs the party went on. Somewhere in that mansion, a man who loved his fiancée with his whole heart had no idea that everything he believed about her was about to change forever. Daniel Whitfield had built his company on one simple belief: that people deserved to be treated with dignity, no matter their job title. It was why his employees, from the janitors to the executives, called him by his first name. It was why, 3 years ago, when he'd hired a small housekeeping staff for the estate, he'd personally made sure every single one of them had health insurance, fair wages, and paid time off, something almost unheard of in private domestic work. He'd never said much to Rosa directly. Their interactions were the small, ordinary kind: a good morning, a nod in the hallway, a thank you when she brought him coffee during long work calls. But he'd noticed things about her. The way she always finished her work early and then quietly helped the other staff finish theirs. The way she never once, in 3 years, asked for anything beyond her paycheck. The way that whenever his mother came to visit, a woman with early-stage dementia who sometimes grew confused and frightened in unfamiliar rooms, Rosa was the one who sat with her, speaking softly in Spanish and English both, until she calmed down. Daniel's mother didn't always remember Daniel's name on hard days. But she remembered Rosa's. Tonight, Daniel had spent most of the party doing what he always did: working the room, thanking people for coming, making sure his business partners felt important and his old friends felt remembered. It was after 11 when he finally slipped away from the noise, wanting 5 quiet minutes before the toast Isabel's father had planned. He walked upstairs toward his study, past the hallway closet, and stopped. He heard something. A sound so small he almost missed it beneath the music drifting up from downstairs. A muffled, broken sound. Someone crying. Daniel stood still in the hallway, frowning, listening. It was coming from the linen closet. "Hello," he said, stepping closer. "Is someone in there?" The crying stopped instantly, replaced by a held breath so tense Daniel could almost feel it through the door. "Hello," he said again, more firmly now, his hand finding the doorknob. It didn't turn. From the outside, the small brass key that was always left in the lock was gone. "It's okay," Daniel said, crouching slightly, speaking gently now, the way you'd speak to someone frightened. "I'm going to get you out. Just hold on." He didn't have a key on him. He thought for half a second about calling for one of the staff, then decided against it. Whoever was in there was clearly terrified, and the last thing they needed was an audience. He remembered instead that the lock on this particular closet was old, original to the house, the kind that could be opened with enough patient force. He gripped the handle, put his shoulder against the frame, and pushed. Took 3 tries. On the third, the old lock gave way with a splintering crack, and the door swung open. And there, in the near dark of the closet, surrounded by folded towels she had straightened herself only an hour earlier, was Rosa. Her uniform damp with sweat and tears, her hands shaking, her eyes wide with a fear Daniel had never once seen on her face in 3 years of knowing her. "Rosa!" Daniel's voice cracked with disbelief. "Rosa, what happened? Who did this?" Rosa looked up at him, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. Because behind Daniel, at the top of the staircase, dressed in blue satin with a champagne glass still in her hand, Isabel Grant had just appeared, and the look on her face when she saw the broken closet door and the man kneeling in front of it was not confusion. It was panic. For a long, frozen moment nobody spoke. Daniel turned first. He saw Isabel standing at the top of the stairs, and something in her expression, the way her smile had vanished the instant she rounded the corner, the way her eyes flicked from Daniel to Rosa to the broken door and back again, told him with a sick certainty in his stomach that this was not a coincidence. "Isabel." His voice was quiet. Too quiet. "Did you lock her in there?" "Daniel, sweetheart, let's not do this in front of everyone," Isabel started, glancing over her shoulder to where a few curious guests had begun drifting toward the staircase, drawn by the sound of splintering wood. "Did you lock her in there?" Daniel said again, and this time it wasn't a question. Rosa, still trembling on the closet floor, found her voice. "She found me with some papers," she said softly, not looking at Isabel, looking only at the man crouched in front of her. "I didn't mean to see them. They fell out of a box. I was just picking them up." "What papers?" Daniel asked. Isabel's face went pale beneath her makeup. "Daniel, she's lying, she's trying to." "What papers, Rosa?" Rosa hesitated. She looked, for the first time all night, genuinely torn. Not because she wanted to protect Isabel, but because some old, deep instinct told her that speaking the truth out loud in a house like this, as a woman like her, could cost her everything. Her job, her visa sponsorship, maybe even her daughter's stability, if things went wrong enough. "Rosa," Daniel said gently, kneeling closer. His voice the same one he used with his mother on her confused days. "You're not in trouble. Whatever it is. I promise you." Rosa took a breath. "There was a marriage certificate," she said. "From 4 years ago. Her name is on it. Not Isabel Grant. A different last name. Married to a man named Peter Voss." The hallway went completely silent except for the faint, distant music still playing downstairs. "There were other papers too," Rosa continued, her voice growing steadier now that the truth was finally moving. "Financial documents. Wire transfers. Something about a life insurance policy recently updated, I think because the date was only 2 weeks ago. I don't understand all of it. I just saw the names and the amount and I got scared, and that's when she found me." Daniel slowly turned to look at Isabel. She was still standing at the top of the stairs, champagne glass forgotten in her hand, her carefully painted face now cracking at the edges like porcelain under pressure. "Daniel," she said, and her voice had lost every trace of the warmth he'd fallen in love with 18 months ago. "I can explain everything. Please. Just not here. Not like this." But Daniel wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking down at Rosa, at the woman who had spent 3 years quietly caring for his household and his mother without ever once asking for recognition, who had just been locked in a dark closet for the crime of accidentally discovering the truth, while the woman he was going to marry stood at the top of the stairs in blue satin, still holding her champagne. He reached out and gently helped Rosa to her feet. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," Rosa whispered. "Just scared." "You're safe now," Daniel said. And then louder to the small crowd of guests now gathering at the base of the stairs, whispering behind raised hands. He said the words that would end the party, end the engagement, and end the life Isabel Grant had spent nearly 2 years carefully constructing. "Somebody call the police. And somebody get this woman a glass of water." He wasn't talking about Isabel. The next hour unfolded like something out of a movie Daniel never wanted to star in. The police arrived within 20 minutes. Daniel had called them directly, not out of anger alone, but because a name like Peter Voss, combined with a recently updated life insurance policy naming Daniel as the insured and Isabel as the sole beneficiary, was not something he was willing to sit on and discuss privately, as Isabel kept begging him to do. While two officers spoke with Isabel in the study, her voice rising and falling through the closed door in tones that shifted between pleading and cold, calculated denial, Daniel sat with Rosa in the kitchen, away from the noise, away from the guests who were quietly gathering their coats and slipping out the front door, whispering to each other about what they'd just witnessed. "I need to tell you something," Daniel said, sitting across from Rosa at the long marble island where, most mornings, he drank his coffee alone before sunrise calls with his team in Singapore. "I don't know everything yet. But what I do know is this: you didn't do anything wrong tonight. You found something you weren't supposed to find, and instead of being protected, you were punished for it. Sorry. I am so sorry that happened to you in my own home." Rosa wrapped both hands around the mug of tea one of the other staff had made her, her fingers still trembling slightly. "I was scared I would lose my job," she admitted quietly. "That's all I could think about in there. Not what I saw. Just, what happens to my daughter if I lose this job?" Something in Daniel's chest tightened at that. In 3 years he realized. He had never once asked Rosa about her life outside these walls. He hadn't known she had a daughter until this exact moment. "You have a daughter," he said softly. "Lucia," Rosa said, and for the first time all night, something like a small, exhausted smile touched her face. "She's 6. She wants to be a scientist. She asks me every single day why the sky is blue, and every single day I give her a different wrong answer just to see if she'll catch me." Daniel found himself smiling too, despite everything. "Does she catch you?" "Every time," Rosa said. "She's smarter than both her parents combined." It was a small moment. An ordinary moment, even in the middle of a night that had stopped being ordinary. The second Isabel Grant had shoved a woman into a dark closet and locked the door. But something about it, the simple human warmth of two people talking about a 6-year-old who wanted to be a scientist, in the middle of a house falling apart around them, planted something in Daniel that would grow, over the following weeks, into a decision that would change both of their lives. Later that night, after the police had finished their initial questioning, after Isabel had been escorted out of the house she had spent 2 years redecorating in her own image, after the last guest's car had pulled out of the long gravel driveway, Daniel learned the fuller truth. Isabel Grant was not, and had never legally stopped being, Isabel Voss. Her marriage to Peter Voss, a man who, investigators would later discover, had died under circumstances eerily similar to the accident being quietly planned for Daniel, had never been dissolved. She had simply left him, changed her professional name, and built an entirely new identity in San Francisco's social circles, one calculated introduction at a time, until she found Daniel. Successful, trusting and, crucially, recently estranged from the family lawyer who might have caught the forged documents she'd used to fast-track a life insurance policy naming herself as sole beneficiary of a sum that would have made her one of the wealthiest women in the state. The wedding, 6 weeks away, had never been about love at all. And if Rosa Delgado hadn't knocked over a small forgotten box while straightening towels, if she hadn't been locked in that closet, if Daniel hadn't heard her crying through a door he almost walked past, he might never have found out until it was far, far too late. The weeks that followed were a blur of lawyers, statements, and a media storm that Daniel hadn't wanted but couldn't avoid. Silicon Valley billionaire's fiancée arrested in suspected insurance fraud plot, ran across headlines from local news to national outlets within 72 hours. Reporters camped outside the estate gates. Daniel's phone filled with messages from people he hadn't spoken to in years, all suddenly very concerned about his well-being. Through all of it, one thing stayed steady in his mind: the image of Rosa sitting on that closet floor, and the quiet, exhausted way she'd talked about her daughter afterward, as if nothing that had just happened to her mattered as much as making sure Lucia never found out her mother had been afraid. Daniel gave Rosa 2 weeks of paid leave, though she insisted she didn't need it. He personally made sure the police report noted her as a victim, not a witness caught in a domestic dispute, protecting her from any complications with her immigration status. He hired a lawyer, not for himself this time but for her, to make sure nothing about that night could ever be used against her. But it was something smaller that changed things between them. About 10 days after the incident, Daniel found himself standing in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, unable to sleep, when Rosa arrived for her shift. She looked surprised to see him up so early. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, gesturing at the coffee machine he'd apparently been staring at without actually using. "Also, I have no idea how this thing works. Isabel used to make the coffee." It was the first time either of them had said her name out loud since the arrest. Rosa, without a word, gently moved him aside and started the machine herself, the motion so practiced it looked like muscle memory. "You've had this machine for 3 years," she said, a small smile tugging at her mouth. "And you never learned how to use it?" "I built a company that manages 12 million users' data in real time," Daniel said. "This machine has 14 buttons and I understand none of them." Rosa actually laughed. A real laugh, warm and unguarded, the first Daniel had heard from her in the 10 days since that night. And something about hearing it, in his quiet kitchen at 7 in the morning, made him realize how rarely, in 18 months with Isabel, he had heard a laugh that didn't feel like it was being performed for an audience. They talked, that morning, longer than they ever had in 3 years of Rosa working in his home. About Lucia's questions about the sky. About Rosa's late husband, who had died in a workplace accident back in Guatemala before Lucia was born, and how she'd made the impossible decision to leave everything she knew to give her daughter a chance at something bigger. About Daniel's own late father, a mechanic who'd worked 60-hour weeks and never once made Daniel feel like the money he eventually earned mattered more than the character he built earning it. He would have hated Isabel, Daniel admitted quietly. He always said you can tell everything about a person by how they treat someone who can't do anything for them. Rosa didn't say anything to that. She didn't need to. They both already understood exactly what he meant. It wasn't romantic, not yet. Not even close. Not with a criminal case still unfolding and a woman who had genuinely believed she was about to marry someone completely different from who Isabel turned out to be. But something had shifted. A door, quite literally, had been broken open that night, and neither Daniel nor Rosa had quite managed to close it since. 3 months passed. Isabel's case moved slowly through the legal system, as these things often do, complicated by the discovery, thanks to persistent investigators following the thread Rosa had accidentally pulled loose, that Peter Voss's death 2 years earlier had not, in fact, been the accidental drowning it was originally ruled. New evidence, combined with financial records showing Isabel had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on him only months before his death, reopened the case entirely. What had started as a fraud investigation into Daniel's near marriage had become something far darker and far more serious. Daniel testified. It was, by his own account, one of the hardest things he'd ever done, sitting in a courtroom, describing in careful, unemotional detail the woman he had planned to spend his life with, watching her sit at the defendant's table in a plain gray suit that couldn't have been further from the blue satin gown she'd worn the night everything fell apart. Rosa testified too. She was terrified beforehand. Daniel could see it in the way her hands shook as she waited outside the courtroom, in the way she kept smoothing down a blouse that didn't need smoothing. But when she took the stand, something in her steadied. She told the truth, plainly and without embellishment, the same way she'd told it to Daniel in his kitchen the night it happened. A woman with nothing to gain from lying, describing exactly what she'd seen and exactly what had been done to her because of it. Her testimony, prosecutors later told Daniel, was one of the most important pieces of the entire case. Not because of the documents themselves, which had since been fully authenticated by forensic accountants, but because Rosa's account of Isabel's panic, her immediate instinct to silence and hide rather than explain, painted a portrait of consciousness of guilt that no financial spreadsheet could have shown a jury on its own. Outside the courthouse one afternoon, after a particularly long day of testimony, Daniel found Rosa sitting alone on a bench, still in the modest navy dress she'd worn for court, looking utterly drained. "You okay?" he asked, sitting down beside her. "I keep thinking about how close it was," Rosa said quietly, staring straight ahead at the traffic passing on the street below. "If I hadn't knocked over that box, if you hadn't heard me crying, you would have married her." And then, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They both knew what the "and then" would have eventually meant, given what investigators now believed about Peter Voss. "You saved my life," Daniel said. It wasn't dramatic exaggeration. It was quite simply the truth, and they both knew it. "Not just my money. My actual life, Rosa." Rosa turned to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face for a long moment. "I was just cleaning a closet," she said softly, almost like she still couldn't quite believe how much had unfolded from something so small and ordinary. "I know," Daniel said. "That's what makes it feel so unbelievable. The most important moment of my entire life happened because you were doing your job well. Because you noticed something out of place and you cared enough to fix it, even though it wasn't really your responsibility to notice." Rosa didn't have an answer for that. She just sat there on the bench outside the courthouse and let the quiet settle between them. Not an uncomfortable quiet, but the kind that exists between two people who have started, slowly and carefully, to trust one another in a way that has nothing left to do with employer and employee. By the 6th month, Isabel had accepted a plea deal on the fraud charges, though the homicide investigation into Peter Voss's death remained ongoing, separate and far more serious. She would not be walking free again for a long time, if ever. Daniel felt, when the news came, not triumph, but a strange, heavy relief. The kind that comes after finally putting down something you've been carrying so long you forgot how much it weighed. Life at the estate had changed in ways Daniel hadn't fully expected. The house felt lighter somehow, less like a stage set for a life he'd been performing and more like an actual home. He found himself increasingly looking forward to the small moments, the mornings when Rosa taught him badly how to make his own coffee, the evenings when his mother, on her clearer days, would ask Rosa to sit with her and tell her about Lucia, whom she'd started calling "my little scientist," even though she'd never met the girl. That, in fact, was what changed everything. "Bring her sometime," Daniel's mother had said one evening, gripping Rosa's hand across the dinner table with more clarity than she'd shown in weeks. "Bring your daughter. I want to meet the girl who asks why the sky is blue." Rosa had looked, in that moment, torn between propriety and something that looked a lot like hope. "I don't want to impose, Mrs. Whitfield. This isn't really." "Nonsense," Daniel's mother said. "This house has had enough sadness in it. Bring some joy into it for once." So, on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks later, Lucia Delgado walked through the front doors of the Whitfield estate for the first time, wide-eyed at the chandeliers, tightly gripping her mother's hand, wearing a backpack shaped like a rocket ship because, she informed everyone within 30 seconds of arriving, she was going to be an astronaut now, not just a scientist, because scientists don't get to actually go to space. "And I want to go to space." Daniel crouched down to her eye level in the entryway. The same entryway where, months earlier, he'd broken open a locked closet door and found her mother crying inside. "Well," he said seriously, "you're going to need to know a lot about physics for that. Do you know what gravity is?" "It's the thing that makes stuff fall down," Lucia said immediately, with the confidence of a 6-year-old who has clearly rehearsed this answer many times. "Close," Daniel said, grinning. "Want me to show you something cool about it?" He spent the next hour in the backyard with Lucia, dropping various objects off the back porch steps to demonstrate that a bowling ball and a tennis ball, air resistance aside, actually fall at the same rate. A fact Lucia found so outrageous she made him repeat the demonstration 4 times, shrieking with delighted disbelief each time. Rosa stood at the kitchen window, watching the two of them in the yard, and found herself crying for the second time in that house. But this time the tears had nothing to do with fear. Daniel's mother came to stand beside her, following her gaze out the window. "You know," the older woman said quietly, "my husband used to say you can tell everything about a man by how he is with children who aren't his own." Rosa didn't trust herself to speak. She just nodded, watching her daughter's rocket ship backpack bounce as she ran across the lawn, laughing, chasing a man who 6 months ago had broken down a door to save her mother's life. It would be easy, at this point in the story, to say that Daniel and Rosa fell instantly, dramatically in love. The kind of movie ending where the credits roll the moment two people realize their feelings. But real life, Daniel had learned the hard way, doesn't work like that. Real love, the kind that lasts, builds slowly, brick by brick, out of 1,000 small honest moments rather than one grand gesture. It was closer to a year after that terrible chandelier-lit night before Daniel finally said anything at all. They were in the kitchen. Always the kitchen, it seemed, was where the truth found them. Late on a Tuesday evening, Lucia asleep in the guest room upstairs after yet another Saturday-turned-week-long visit, Daniel's mother resting comfortably after a good week. The house quiet in that particular way houses get quiet only after the people in them have stopped performing for anyone. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said, setting down the mug of coffee Rosa had, over the past year, finally taught him to make competently. "Of course. Do you ever think about how strange it is," he said, "that the worst night of my life and one of the worst nights of yours ended up being the same night? That something so awful became the reason we actually know each other at all?" Rosa considered this for a long moment, wiping down the counter out of habit more than necessity. "I think about it every day," she admitted. "I used to think that night ruined everything. Now I don't know how to explain it. I think maybe it was the only way something true could get through all the noise. If she hadn't locked that door, you would have married her without ever really knowing me. Without ever really knowing yourself, maybe." Daniel set the mug down. "I've been wanting to say something for a while now," he said, and for the first time since Rosa had known him, through a scandal, a trial, 100 quiet mornings, he sounded nervous. "I'm not asking because of gratitude or guilt or anything that happened that night. I need you to know that. I'm asking because every single day since then, the moments I look forward to most are the ordinary ones. Puffy. Lucia's terrible jokes about gravity. You laughing at how bad I still am at making toast, even after a year of lessons." Rosa had gone very still, the dish towel forgotten in her hands. "I think I'm in love with you," Daniel said simply. "And I understand completely if that complicates everything, if it's inappropriate given how we know each other, if you need time, or if you just don't feel the same way. But I couldn't keep pretending this was just gratitude anymore. It stopped being that a long time ago." For a moment Rosa said nothing at all. Then, quietly, she set down the towel, crossed the kitchen, and did something she had wanted to do for longer than she'd let herself admit even to herself. She reached out and took his hand. "I was so scared to feel this," she whispered. "Because of everything, my job, Lucia, everything I could lose if I was wrong about you. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the morning you didn't know how to make coffee." Daniel laughed, a real, surprised, joyful laugh. And in the quiet of that kitchen, with the whole house asleep around them, something that had started with a locked door and a stranger's tears finally became something entirely different. Something neither of them had been looking for, and both of them had needed. News of Daniel Whitfield's engagement to his housekeeper spread almost as fast as the scandal that had ended his first one, though this time the headlines were kinder, if a little sensational. "Billionaire finds love with housekeeper who saved his life," one outlet wrote, which made Rosa laugh so hard she nearly choked on her coffee. "I didn't save your life," she told him. "I got locked in a closet." "Semantics," Daniel said. Not everyone approved, of course. Some of Daniel's old social circle, the same circle that had toasted his engagement to Isabel without a single question, whispered about class, about optics, about whether it was appropriate. Daniel found, to his own surprise, that he cared less and less about their opinions with each passing month. His father's old words kept coming back to him. You can tell everything about a person by how they treat someone who can't do anything for them. Rosa had never had anything to offer him except her honesty, her kindness, and on one terrifying night, the truth he desperately needed to hear. That, it turned out, was worth infinitely more than anything Isabel had ever offered. The wedding, when it finally happened, was nothing like the one that had been planned a year and a half earlier. There was no chandelier-lit ballroom, no 3 magazines fighting for exclusive coverage. It was held in the backyard of the estate, the same backyard where Daniel had once taught a 6-year-old about gravity with a bowling ball and a tennis ball, under a simple white arch with maybe 60 guests, most of them people who had actually mattered in both of their lives rather than people who mattered to a headline. Lucia, now 7, was the flower girl, though she insisted on wearing her rocket ship backpack over her dress in case there's an emergency, a compromise Daniel fully supported. Daniel's mother, on one of her clearest days in months, sat in the front row and cried through the entire ceremony, gripping Lucia's hand tightly beside her. And when Daniel turned to see Rosa walking toward him, not in blue satin, but in a simple ivory dress she'd chosen herself, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her face open and unguarded in a way that had nothing to do with performing for anyone watching. He thought about that terrible night, the sound of crying behind a locked door, the moment everything he thought he understood about his own life had shattered. And he understood, standing there, that sometimes the worst nights of your life are the ones quietly building the foundation for everything good that comes after, if you're willing to open the door instead of walking past it. 2 years later, on a Tuesday morning that looked exactly like 1,000 other ordinary Tuesday mornings, Daniel stood in the kitchen making coffee. Competently now, 4 buttons memorized, no supervision required, while Rosa sat at the counter helping Lucia, now 9, with a science project about the solar system that had somehow taken over half the kitchen table with painted foam planets. "Did you know," Lucia announced to the room at large, not looking up from her paint-covered hands, "that a day on Venus is longer than a year on Venus? That's so weird. That's the weirdest thing I've ever heard." "That is genuinely strange," Daniel agreed, setting a mug down in front of Rosa. Daniel's mother, in the sunroom just off the kitchen, called out that she wanted to hear about Venus too, and Lucia scrambled off her stool immediately to go explain it to her, foam planets and all, because if there was one thing Lucia loved more than being right about gravity, it was having an audience. Rosa watched her daughter go, then turned back to Daniel, wrapping both hands around her mug the same way she had that first terrible night in this house, except now there was nothing to be afraid of at all. "Do you ever think about her?" Rosa asked quietly. She didn't have to say the name. They both knew who she meant. "Sometimes," Daniel admitted. "Not with anger anymore. Mostly with a strange kind of gratitude, honestly, which I know sounds insane." "It doesn't," Rosa said. "I think about it too. If she hadn't locked that door, we wouldn't be here," Daniel finished. They sat with that for a moment, the strange, twisted logic of it, the way the worst night of both their lives had become, in hindsight, the hinge on which everything good in their futures had turned. Not because betrayal and fear were good things. They weren't. But because sometimes, in the wreckage of something false, you find the one true thing you were never even looking for. If there's one thing this story taught me, it's this. The people who show us who they really are in ordinary moments, the way they treat someone who can't do anything for them, the way they act when no one important is watching, are the people worth paying attention to. Wealth doesn't show you a person's character. Small moments do. Locked door. Crying stranger. A choice to walk past or a choice to stop and listen. Daniel had everything money could buy the night that closet door opened. But it wasn't until he found something money could never have given him, a woman with nothing to gain from being honest, and everything to lose from speaking up anyway, that he finally understood what he'd actually been missing all along. If this story moved you even a little tonight, I'd be so grateful if you hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because we've got so many more waiting to be told. And if you know someone who could use a reminder that the truth always finds its way to the light, eventually, send this one their way. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.